I spent 31 years working as a family court mediator. People came to me in the worst moments of their lives, screaming, crying, threatening each other across a table, and my job was to stay calm, to listen, to find the thread that connected two people who had forgotten why they ever loved each other in the first place. I was good at it. I retired with a plaque on my wall and a reputation for never losing my composure. I tell you that so you understand what it meant when I saw my daughter's husband raise his hand at her across a holiday dinner table. And I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat very still, the way I'd trained myself to do for 31 years, and I started making a plan. I want to tell you about my daughter. Her name is Simone. She was the kind of child who collected stray cats and wrote thank you notes without being told and stayed up late reading books she wasn't supposed to understand yet. She grew up to be a high school English teacher, the kind students come back to visit years later. She had her father's patience and my stubbornness, and for most of her life, that combination served her beautifully. She met her husband. I'll call him my son-in-law, though that word has curdled in my mouth ever since, at a teachers' conference in Atlanta. His name was Raymond. He taught history at a private school across town. He was 41, a few years older than Simone, with silver starting at his temples and a way of speaking that made everything sound considered, deliberate, important. The first time she brought him to meet me, I made pot roast and sweet potato pie. He arrived with flowers. Not the grocery store kind, the kind from a real florist, wrapped in brown paper. He complimented my home. He asked about my career with what seemed like genuine interest. He laughed easily. He looked at my daughter like she was the most interesting person in any room. I liked him. I want to say that plainly. I liked him very much. There were small things even then. The way he'd finish her sentences, not rudely, almost tenderly, but he did it constantly. The way he'd redirect a conversation that was about her accomplishments toward something he'd observed about her, as if her story needed his narration to be complete. Once, over dessert, she started telling a story about a student who'd written an extraordinary essay, and Raymond gently said, "She's being modest. The real story is how she structured the whole unit and steered the table toward his version of events." Simone smiled and let him. I noticed. I told myself it was love. That's what I told myself. They got engaged after 14 months. The wedding was in June, a garden ceremony. Simone in a cream dress with her hair pinned up the way she'd worn it since she was a little girl. She cried when she saw me in the receiving line. I cried too. Raymond's mother, I'll call her his mother because that's all she ever was to me, a title without warmth, stood near the cake table with her arms crossed, watching the dancing like she was evaluating a performance that wasn't quite meeting her standards. His mother was a retired professor, 70 years old, sharp as glass, and twice as cutting. She had opinions about everything: how Simone cooked, how she decorated, how she spoke in public, how she wore her hair. She delivered these opinions the way people deliver facts, not cruelly at first, just matter-of-factly, as if she were simply informing Simone of a reality Simone had somehow missed. In the first year of their marriage, Simone called me often. We had always been close, but I started to notice a change in how she spoke, a kind of hesitation before her own sentences, a habit of prefacing her opinions with "Raymond thinks," or "Raymond says," or "I might be wrong, but..." She had never spoken that way before. My daughter had never been a woman who prefaced her own thoughts with apologies. I asked her once, carefully, if everything was all right. She said yes. Of course, she was just adjusting to being a wife. It was a lot of changes at once. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I am not proud of how long I wanted to believe her. The calls got shorter, then less frequent. When I called her, she often sounded distracted, like she was listening for something in another room. When I asked if Raymond was home, she'd say yes, and something in her voice would shift, a tightening I couldn't quite name. I started calling on Saturday mornings when I knew he had a standing tennis game with a colleague. On those calls, she sounded more like herself. We'd talk for an hour. She'd laugh the way she used to laugh. On the calls when he was home, we rarely lasted 20 minutes. I mentioned this to my sister. She said I was reading too much into it. I mentioned it to my closest friend, a woman who'd been a social worker for decades. She got quiet in a way that stayed with me. There was a birthday dinner, Simone's birthday, her 39th. Raymond's mother had suggested they host it at their home rather than go to a restaurant, and Simone had agreed, and I arrived with flowers and a card and a gift. I'd wrapped myself, the way I always had. The house was clean, in a way that felt effortful, staged, almost. Simone met me at the door, and she looked beautiful. She always looked beautiful, but there was something around her eyes, a tiredness that makeup hadn't covered. Raymond's mother was already there, seated at the head of the dining room table as if she lived there. Dinner was Simone's cooking. She had always been an excellent cook, something she came by honestly because her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother's food was the kind that made people stop talking. Simone had made a roast chicken with herbs, roasted vegetables, cornbread. It was the meal she'd learned to make at 12 years old and had made 100 times since. Raymond's mother tasted the chicken and set her fork down. "It's a little dry," she said, not to Simone specifically. "To the table, the way you might comment on the weather," Simone said. "I'm sorry, I think the oven was running a little hot." "Raymond has mentioned she struggles with timing," his mother said, to me, as if Simone weren't sitting 3 feet away. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. I said pleasantly, "I've eaten Simone's cooking for nearly 40 years. She's never once struggled with timing." Raymond's mother smiled at me the way adults smile at children who have said something embarrassingly sincere. "Well," she said, "we all see what we want to see." Raymond said nothing. He refilled his own glass. I watched my daughter for the rest of that dinner. I watched how she asked permission before getting up from the table. Not asked exactly, but she'd glance at Raymond before she rose. A quick, involuntary check. The way people check a door before entering a room they're uncertain about. I watched how she laughed only after he laughed. How she agreed with everything his mother said. How she had become, at her own birthday dinner, a guest in her own home. After dinner, while Raymond and his mother sat in the living room, I followed Simone into the kitchen under the pretense of helping with dishes. I turned on the faucet, an old habit, covering sound, and I asked her quietly how she was really doing. She handed me a dish, and she didn't look at me, and she said, "I'm fine, Mom. I just want tonight to go smoothly." "For who?" I asked. She didn't answer. She handed me another dish. I drove home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time. Things I had learned in 31 years of family court mediation. Abusive relationships rarely begin with violence. They begin with small erosions, a comment here, a look there, a pattern of correction so gradual the person inside it can't locate the moment it started. By the time anything visible happens, the person has already been altered, their instincts worn down, their self-trust replaced with constant second-guessing. They don't tell anyone because they've been taught, slowly and without a single explicit lesson, that their perception cannot be trusted. I knew what I was looking at. I had looked at it for 3 decades across a table from strangers. It took me 2 years to see it in my own child. I have not forgiven myself for that, and I probably won't. The event that I think of as the turning point, though nothing ever turns on a single point, that's a lie we tell in hindsight, happened on a Sunday evening in October. I had been invited for dinner. "Just family," Raymond had said over the phone, relaxed and easy. "Just the 3 of us." I brought wine. I rang the bell. Raymond answered. From the kitchen, I could hear the sounds of cooking. The television in the living room was on a news channel. Raymond's mother was not there, just the 3 of us, as promised, which should have felt like relief, but something in the atmosphere of the house was different, too quiet, too still. Simone came out of the kitchen looking tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. She hugged me and I held her a moment longer than usual. She let me. Dinner was pasta, a recipe she'd had for years, the kind with a tomato cream sauce that her father had loved. She had clearly worked on it. The table was set carefully. There was a candle. Raymond sat down, looked at his plate, and said, "You burned the garlic again." Not unkindly. The way you'd say someone had missed a turn. Simone said, "I don't think it's burned. I think it's bitter." He took one more bite, set his fork down. "It's the same thing every time." The table went silent. I looked at my daughter. She was sitting very still with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way a person holds themselves when they are waiting for something to pass, a posture I recognized from years of watching people endure things they had learned they were not allowed to react to. And then she said quietly, "I'm sorry." That apology. Something in me went cold and sharp at once, the way glass feels right before it breaks. Raymond turned to me then, pleasant as anything, and asked about my week. I answered him. I was polite. I ate my dinner. The garlic was not bitter. The pasta was, in fact, very good. I complimented it, and Simone looked at me the way a person looks when someone has named something they had stopped being able to name for themselves. After dinner, Raymond went to watch television. Simone and I cleared the table. In the kitchen, with the water running again, I put my hand on her arm. I said, "Simone, I need you to hear me." She said, "Mom." I said, "When did you last call one of your friends? Just to talk." She thought about it, really thought, and the fact that she had to think about it at all told me everything. I said, "When did you last do something you wanted to do without checking with him first?" She didn't answer. She turned back to the sink. I said, "What you apologized for tonight? The pasta was not wrong. You didn't do anything wrong." She kept washing the dish in her hand. "He has high standards." "That's not what high standards look like," I said. "Mom." Her voice had gone flat. "Please don't." I left it there. I had learned in 31 years that you cannot drag a person out of something they aren't ready to leave. I pressed my lips together and I drove home, and I sat with what I was carrying, and I thought about what I could do, and what I was going to do, and in what order. I want to be honest. I was afraid, not for myself, for her. Not of what he might do in some dramatic sense. I was afraid of the quieter damage, the kind that doesn't leave bruises, the kind that hollows a person out over years until they look in the mirror and no longer recognize what they were before. I knew that kind of damage. I had watched it happen to women across my desk for 3 decades. I had never watched it happen to my daughter. The difference between watching it happen to strangers and watching it happen to someone you love is a difference I cannot find adequate language for. I started making calls, not to Raymond, not to anyone in his life. I called an old colleague, a woman who had spent her career in domestic advocacy and knew every resource in our city and a few in neighboring ones. I called Simone's old roommate from college, a woman named Teresa, who still lived nearby and who I knew had always been able to reach my daughter in ways I sometimes couldn't. I called my sister and told her what I had been seeing and watched my sister's expression on the video call change from skepticism to something quieter. And I waited. I hate that I had to wait. But I know from decades of doing this work that intervening before someone is ready can push them deeper in, can make the person protecting the relationship dig in harder. So I kept calling Simone on Saturday mornings. I kept showing up for dinners when invited. I kept my voice even, and I kept my eyes open, and I kept not looking away. The night things broke open was November, a Friday. Raymond's mother had come for the weekend. I had been invited for Saturday dinner, a standing arrangement that had developed over the months, the 4 of us, which I had agreed to because being present was better than being absent. I arrived to find the table already set. Raymond's mother already in her customary seat at the head of the table, Raymond pouring drinks, and Simone in the kitchen. I went to help her. She was plating food, a pot roast, slow cooked. She had been up since early morning working on it. I could tell by the way the kitchen smelled and by the fact that when I kissed her cheek, she looked like someone who had been standing at a stove for 8 hours. "It smells incredible," I told her. She gave me a small, careful smile. We brought the food to the table. Raymond's mother examined her portion. She made a sound. Not quite a word, just a sound. The kind that means assessment. And then she said, "Raymond, doesn't this taste different from the way your grandmother used to make it?" Raymond took a bite. He chewed. He did not look at Simone. He said, a little. "She always salted the meat overnight," his mother said. "Did you salt overnight?" she asked Simone. "I salted in the morning," Simone said. "I looked up several." "That's the difference," Raymond's mother said. Closing the subject, moving on, Simone said nothing. She picked up her fork. And then, I don't know exactly what preceded it, whether there was something in the way Simone set her fork down, or some look on her face, or simply nothing, nothing at all. Raymond said very quietly, "You could just say thank you for the feedback instead of making a face." Simone said, "I didn't make a face." Raymond said, "Simone." She said, "I didn't. I was just." And he reached across the corner of the table and he put his hand on her forearm. Hard, not a hit exactly, a grip. And he said through his teeth, "I said, don't make a face." His mother watched this happen. She looked at her plate and then she looked back up and she reached for her wine glass. I put my fork down. I looked at my daughter. She had gone completely still, the way she used to go still as a small child when she was trying very hard not to cry in public. That particular stillness. And I watched her blink once, slowly, and drop her gaze to her plate. I stood up. I said, "Simone." She looked at me. I said, "Get your purse." Raymond said, "Excuse me." I did not look at him. I looked at my daughter. "Sweetheart, get your purse." His mother said, "There's no need for this kind of—" "Simone," I said. And something happened in my daughter's face. Something that had been locked for a long time shifted. A small visible thing, and she pushed back from the table and she stood up. Raymond said, "Sit down." I said, "She's coming with me." He said, "You don't come into my house and—" I looked at him then. For the first time that evening, I looked directly at him and I said, very quietly, "I have spent 31 years learning exactly what is happening in this house, and I have been patient. I am done being patient." I took my daughter by the hand. We walked to the front door. She took her purse off the hook in the entryway. Her hands were shaking and she fumbled with the strap, and I waited, and we walked out. We sat in my car. She cried for a long time, the kind of crying that has been saved up, pressed down for months or maybe years, the kind that sounds less like sadness and more like release. I did not say anything. I let her cry. I had tissues in my glove compartment. I have always had tissues in my glove compartment. Some habits never leave. When she stopped, she said, "I don't know when it started." I said, "I know." She said, "It was so slow." I said, "I know." She said, "I kept thinking I was the problem." I took her hand. "You were never the problem." She stayed with me that night. She took the small bedroom that used to be hers, the one with the blue curtains she picked out when she was 17. In the morning I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table for a long time without talking very much, and that silence was different from the silences I had noticed over the previous 2 years. That silence was rest. That silence had no fear in it. In the weeks that followed, there were things to be done. Hard things, logistical things, the kind that require lawyers and paperwork and difficult phone calls. My colleague connected Simone with a counselor who specialized in exactly this. Teresa came and helped her pack what she needed from the house on a day when Raymond was at work. My sister drove 4 hours to be there. Raymond called me once. He was calmer than I expected, which told me he was more sophisticated about this than I had hoped. He said he thought we had gotten off on the wrong foot and would I be willing to talk. I said no. He said he loved my daughter. I said people who love my daughter don't make her apologize for pasta she cooked for 8 hours. I hung up. His mother sent Simone a letter. I never asked what it said. Simone threw it away without finishing it, which I thought showed considerable wisdom. The divorce took 8 months. It was not easy. None of it was easy. I won't tell you it was because you deserve honesty more than you deserve a tidy ending. What I will tell you is this. 6 months after Simone moved back to this city, she started running in the mornings. Just around the neighborhood, 20 minutes at first, then longer. She started cooking again, really cooking, the elaborate weekend project she used to love before she'd learned to shrink her ambitions to avoid criticism. She called her friends, her real friends, the ones she drifted from over 2 years of a marriage that required her full attention to maintain at the cost of everything else. She laughed. She disagreed with me about things. She had opinions, again, real ones, delivered without preamble, without asking my permission to have them. There was a morning in the spring when I came to her apartment for coffee, and she opened the door in paint-stained jeans, her hair loose, music playing from the kitchen. She'd been painting her bathroom a color she described as somewhere between sage and stubbornness. She laughed when she said it, a real laugh, no hesitation. I stood in her doorway and I thought, there you are. I want to say something to whoever is listening to this and recognizes any piece of what I've described, the gradual silencing, the shrinking, the apologies for things that didn't require apology, the voice that used to be yours, slowly replaced with something quieter, more careful, more afraid. You are not the problem. You were never the problem. And if there is someone in your life who sees what is happening to you, who is waiting patiently for the moment you are ready, let them in. You don't have to be ready all at once. You can be ready by fractions. You can be ready just enough to get in the car. That's all it takes sometimes. Just getting in the car. I spent 31 years helping strangers find their way out of rooms they thought they were trapped in. The hardest thing I have ever done is wait for my daughter to find the door. The most grateful I have ever been for anything in my life is the moment she walked through it. She runs in the mornings now. I think about that often. What resonated with you in this story, and what city are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. I have thought a lot in the years since that November night about how long things were allowed to go on before I did anything. That's the part I sit with most. Not the night I stood up from the table. That part was easy, in the end, the easiest thing I'd done in years. But the 2 years before it, when I saw the edges of something wrong and told myself I wasn't sure enough to act. What I know now, and wish I had understood sooner, is that the slow erosion of a person is not accidental. Raymond didn't wake up one morning and decide to dismantle my daughter. It happened in increments, each one small enough to explain away, each one leaving Simone a little less certain of herself than she'd been the week before. That's how it works. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives dressed as love, as high standards, as concern. And by the time a person inside it can name what's happening, they've already been taught not to trust their own naming. What Raymond sowed over those years, he reaped not through punishment handed down from somewhere above, but through the simple, relentless logic of how human beings actually work. When you spend years teaching someone to doubt themselves, you do not get a partner. You get a person who has learned to survive you, and a person who has learned to survive you will eventually find the door. That was Simone. She found the door. She walked through it. Not because someone forced her, but because something in her, something he hadn't been able to reach, no matter how many dinners he criticized or how many silences he enforced, was still intact. That's the part I believe most fiercely about people. There is always something left. Something that waits. What I carry from this, And what I hope you carry too, if any of this sounds familiar, is that intelligence without courage is incomplete. I had 31 years of professional knowledge about exactly what was happening in my daughter's marriage. I understood the patterns. I could have written a paper on the psychology of it, and for 2 years I waited. I rationalized. I told myself she needed to come to it herself. Some of that was true. Timing matters, and dragging someone out before they're ready rarely works. But some of it was also just fear dressed up as wisdom. The honest thing is to name that. Moral clarity requires that we act on what we know. Not recklessly, not without care for consequences, but we have to act. Simone deserved someone who acted sooner. I try to hold that without crushing myself under it, and most days I manage. What I want for anyone listening is this: trust what you see. Trust the small, uncomfortable thing you keep explaining away. Trust the version of yourself that existed before someone started editing it. And if someone you love is disappearing in front of you, don't wait until you are completely certain. Certainty in these situations is a luxury that arrives too late. Simone paints her bathroom walls now. She argues with me about movies. She called me last Tuesday just to tell me about a book she's reading for no reason, just because she wanted to. That is what a person looks like when they have been returned to themselves. I know that image by heart. I will never take it for granted.